Hey guys, Wintermute here, and welcome to the Elements of Motion Graphics Part 3, Kinetics. Where we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of animation in Blender and creating a cool motion graphic, a logo intro using these fundamentals while combining some skills we learned in previous episodes of this series. So we'll start from an intro to animation in Blender, and I'm going to tailor this towards complete beginners, and hopefully this will be a bit of a more beginner-friendly video as I've had comments about that, so tell me what you guys feel about this. It will be a little bit more explicit in how I explain things, and I'll try to assume you know less, but this will also result in a much longer video, and I just want to know how you guys feel about the pacing. If you want me to speed it up, or if it's good as it is, slow it down a bit. Now, from there, we're going to go into a couple of useful principles, like how to use squash and stretch, inertia, and shape morphing in motion graphic design. And then we're going to implement those. So we're going to create a logo animation by having some text fly in and create a nice animation synced to a music beat in the background. And we'll export it into a final animation, which you can see right now. Alright, so just before we get started, I wanted to talk about the sponsor for this video, BenQ. So recently a company representative asked me to review their ScreenBar Plus e-reading lamp, and I thought it was pretty cool and an interesting opportunity. So here's what it looks like. The packaging is really nice, and it's only got 3 components, so the setup is really fast. All there is this desktop dial component that controls everything, a separate light component, and a counterweight to hold onto it. There's not too many wires, it's only one, and it's fairly simple to set up. The light attaches to the counterweight, and it's nice to clip. It makes a very satisfying sound. And all you have to do is attach the micro USB plug into the light in order to power it, and connect the other end to a USB port on your computer. So since this is a monitor mounted light with a very slim profile, it prevents a lot of pretty cool advantages. It lights up a large portion of the table very uniformly and provides a pretty soft light that's completely adjustable. You can change both the temperature and intensity of the light, so you can make it cool and warm, and you can also make it a bit dimmer, and there's even an auto dimming function with there's a photoreceptor sort of device on the desktop dial component, which allows you to automatically sense the light and adjust the lighting based on your current conditions, which I think is a pretty cool feature. So to be honest, I've only ever used cheap plastic lights before, and the ScreenBar Plus feels like a pretty big upgrade to my workspace. So since it's monitor mounted, it doesn't really take up any space on my desk, except for the tiny dial, which I think is really convenient, and it actually looks quite nice also. It doesn't create any screen glare at all, which I'm glad for, because otherwise it would make it a bit hard to see, but it's designed in such a way as to not produce any screen glare. It illuminates the desktop very uniformly, so I think it also reduces some eye strain from working later at night, which might be helpful to some of you. I haven't really been using this light for a particularly long amount of time, but I can tell you that the build quality feels fantastic. It's very light and very smooth. Everything feels really professionally machined, and it doesn't feel or look cheap. I think it's really far superior to a normal desk lamp. It's kind of in a different class of lighting because of the way it softly illuminates whatever you're writing on, and I found it very helpful while working in the dark on things like taking down video notes or frantically debugging an app that's exploding. And I find it very helpful to have something that can just illuminate my workspace very naturally and evenly. Now, my only contention with this is that it's a little bit on the pricey side. If you don't have 129 American dollars or about 180 Canadian dollars to spare, this might not be for the lamp for you, and you might want to find a cheaper alternative. But overall, I think this makes for a great addition to a minimalist workspace and creates a really nice and pleasant work environment. First off, an intro to animation in Blender. So the way animation works in Blender and many other software is through keyframes. So a keyframe is sort of like a snapshot in time of a particular property value. So some of these values could be, or some of these properties could be like the position, rotation, and the scale of an object, as well as a ton of other things. For example, we can apply a keyframe to the color, so we can make a color change over time, or pretty much any of these properties here. I think almost every property in Blender is keyframeable, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. All right, so first, you can go to top view by hitting number pad 7, and then we're just going to use this cube as a demonstration. So let's keyframe this cube going from left to right, rotating a bit and then getting a little bit bigger. So hit G to move it. You can hold down Control while you do this and hit X to lock it to the X-axis, and then just move it somewhere on your screen to the left. And then in order to insert a keyframe, you need to hit I on your keyboard. And then you can see that there are a lot of options here. I'm just going to pick Location Rotation Scale. That's what this stands for. And just hold on to it and you'll see all of these fields turn green. And so now we have a snapshot. What this means is that, sorry, by the way, if you're using a different theme, these might be like orange or something, or yellow. It kind of depends on your theme, so they may not turn green for you. Anyways, so right now we have a snapshot in time on frame 1, as you can see on this bottom timeline view. So this means that at frame 1, this is how this cube is going to look. All these properties are going to be saved. And it's at -9, as you can see on the position on the x-axis. Now let's move to frame 100. So let's move it all the way to the other side using the same method. Hit G, then hit X to lock the position to the x-axis, and then you can hit Control to lock it to the grid, and then you can see our position is +9. You could actually just type that in right here, just type in the number. And then you want to hit I again. Actually, wait. Okay, so let's change the rotation also. So you can use the mouse wheel to pan around, and then you can double tap R to have this trackball rotation. So just rotate it like that. And then you can hit S to scale it up. All right, so we have something like that. And then we can hit I again to take another snapshot. A location, rotation, scale, and you see all of these values turn green again, or to whatever your active keyframe color is. And you can see we have 2 snapshots in time, one where it's here and looking like this, and one where the cube is like this. And what Blender will do is it will interpolate between the 2 values. It will go from -9 to 9 over some period of time. And what that looks like, you can see if you click this or you hit space. And yeah, that's pretty much how animation works in Blender. And this applies to pretty much any property. This is a fairly straightforward animation to make, as it's only a couple of the physical properties in the 3D viewport. Now, you can see that, maybe that's not too clear, but at the start, it's kind of slow, and it slows down towards the end, while the middle is rather faster compared to the rest. So that's called an interpolation. That's how Blender bridges these 2 properties, right? So we go from -9 to +9 between frame 0 and 100. So we can say that at frame 50, it's probably going to be exactly in the middle at x = 0. But you can see it's not. That's because of the interpolation. It's not purely a linear transition. And we can see that if we go into the animation tab. So this is sort of what happens to our x position. It goes from -9 to +9, but it's not a straight line. Rather, it's a curve. And this is called an interpolation. If we hit T with our mouse over this panel or over the timeline, we can change that interpolation to a couple of things. And this is like one of Blender's like really powerful and very helpful features, especially for motion graphics. So some uses of these interpolations. So if we go over the timeline, make sure you have these 2 keyframes selected, by the way. You can hit B to marquee select, and then just drag a box over it, or you can just shift select both of them. So shift left mouse button on both of them. All right. And then you can hit T while your mouse is over here, and then you can change it. So if it's linear, then we can see that it's timed exactly, and there's no difference in the speed of anything at any point. Everything just moves linearly. If we set it to circular, then we'll have a very sharp increase. So it'll be very slow at first, and then it accelerates extremely quickly towards the end of the animation, like that. Now, linear will be useful for something like a turntable or an infinite loop. Bezier is the standard, so it's sort of just a normal easing, which is all adjustable also, but we're not going to be doing too much adjustment. And we also have dynamic effects, which are going to be what we'll be focusing on. So what back will do is it'll take you from this keyframe to this keyframe, but it will go past what your values are, and then it's going to come back to them. As you can see, it's going to go. Okay, so let's just play this because that's probably easier. So you'll see it'll tumble past the point, and then it'll gradually shift back. And this is a very useful effect, as you'll see later. What we can also do is, remembering keeping both of these selected, we can change it to bounce. So you can imagine what this does. It's just a normal bounce animation. And we can also have elastic. Now this one can be a little bit trippy at times because I'm not quite sure how it works. It seems to only work with a single keyframe, and I won't be using this too often, but you can see that it kind of makes an elastic sort of bouncing thing. So yeah, this is pretty much all you need to know about animations. One quick tip, instead of hitting I and then scrolling through this menu, we can go to keying, active keying set, and then we can set this. We can basically change our keybind for I. So since I just set this to location, rotation, scale, every time I hit I, that will automatically keyframe the location, rotation, and the scale of the object, and we don't have to go through that menu. And we can always remove it if we just hit the X button beside it. We also have the record keyframes, but you need to be careful while you have this on. We can just like move it to there, and you can see it just automatically made a keyframe of every property that changed. And that's pretty much all there is to the fundamentals of animation in Blender. Now let's talk about some more advanced techniques. Alright, and we have a couple of other principles, although I'm just going to skim through these and talk about their specific implementation during the examples. So first, let's talk about inertia. Inertia is the tendency of a body to resist changes in state. So if something is moving, it's not going to want to be stopped and it will resist. And if something's stopped, it's not going to want to move. And you'll have to deposit some energy to change that. So what does this mean? Well, first it can help us determine the natural way something would move. For example, if we have a long, thin rod, it's going to be much more likely for it to rotate around a specific axis than another due to something called moments of inertia, and which just quantifies the resistance in specific directions of rotation as being lower than others. Now, what about squash and stretch? Well, this is just the idea that we should change the proportions of a form while it's moving in a specific direction. Typically, we can compress it against the direction of movement, although sometimes we want to do it perpendicularly, sometimes parallel to the movement. And this just sort of emphasizes the movement. It makes it feel a lot more alive, and it helps with the stylization. This is very easy to do just by scaling something on an axis. We also can do shape morphs. So Blender has an option called Shapekeys, which allows us to animate a change in the position of the vertices of a model. So normally we can only keyframe the macro level properties of a material, or sorry, of a mesh. We can change its color, its location, rotation, and scale, but we can't change the position of one of the vertices. In order to do that, we need to use Shapekeys, and then we can interpolate between those through a separate method. And this can allow us to morph between different polygons and create some very interesting transitions that are otherwise kind of impossible to create without a super complex set of modifiers. Alright, so to start off, you want to set your render engine to Eevee, and then we're going to insert a music track. You can go to this video editing tab, then hit Shift A, while your mouse is over this timeline, sound, and then I will include a link to this. It's called the High Line. And and I just found it a good track because it had a pretty strong beat, and I thought it would be easy to sync to. So this is what it sounds like. So we're going to be using this as the background track, just because I think having some music to sync this to is a very useful skill. And typically, I like to start with a piece of music, just so I can tailor my animation to that rather than do it the other way around. So in order to start off, I'm not going to be using the toolkit we created because I don't want to import that right now. Instead, if you don't know how to make some of these things, you may want to check that first video, which I'll have linked. But otherwise, I think you should be fine because this is just some very rudimentary modeling. I'm going to start my keyboard shortcut viewer. And okay, so the first thing to create would be a couple of background elements. So we want to create a grid. And a good way to do this is by using the array modifier. So we can just use a simple square like this, apply an array modifier, and then see you have two of these. We'll set the offset to something like 6, so they're quite far apart, 6 square widths apart, and we'll have 40 of these. And okay, so this is only in a single dimension, so we're going to duplicate that. We will change the dimension, and now we'll have it tiled on the y-axis instead. Now we can scale this whole thing down. You can hit the number pad 0 if you have a number pad in order to zoom in on this. If you don't have a number pad, you may want to try to rebind that. But yeah, so we hit number pad 0 and it will focus on this. Let's scale it down a little bit more. Let's move it to the center of the scene by hitting G and just grabbing it. And then we can hit Control Alt number pad 0 in order to position our camera at the top view, which we're looking at. So let's position this grid within the bounds of our camera. And we can remove any extraneous pieces also, and sort of scale it to fit. Don't worry if it's not perfect. It's completely fine as it is. Alright, so you won't be able to see it if we go into rendered view. If you hold down Z, it'll open up a pie menu. You can just go into rendered view. So let's add an emission shader. And now if we render it, it's just going to be a bunch of white squares on a background. If you don't like the centering, you can always just grab it using G and then just move it around and also scale it, just so it fits your liking. So let's set the background color of the world. To do that, we go into the World tab, and then we can just go turn down this background color. I like to tint it a little bit towards the blue side. I like a nice indigo. And then I don't want these white squares to be too prominent, so I'm going to change them to a variant of the background color. I can use the color wheel, and then I can use the eyedropper to sample the background. So now they'll be completely invisible because they're the same as the background color. So all I want to do is just change the color a bit and make it sort of close. And now this looks a lot more appealing, I think. So the first animation we'll have is a sort of reveal of this background. And the best way to do that is by using the BoolTools add-on. So make sure you have this installed. Please check out my first video if you don't know how to do it. It's included in Blender, where you can just search it up. It's very easy. You can do it in a second. So create a circle, go into edit mode by hitting tab, and then extrude it up by hitting E. And you'll have a cylinder. You can double click the edges and then fill it if you want. And you want to make sure it's overlapping with the grid. And this is because we want to make sort of a cookie cutter effect. We want to reveal everything from the center. So you want to move this generally to the center of the screen, or wherever you want really. You could move it to a corner. And then you want to select this cylinder, select the grid, and then hit Ctrl-Shift-B in order to open up the BoolTool dialog. And then you need to apply the brush boolean intersect function. And you can see that it basically did a cookie cutter. We just cut out a cylindrical section of the grid. And if we scale it, you can see that the whole grid will show up. So now let's scale it down until we can see nothing. and we'll insert a keyframe. So at frame 1 on our timeline, we'll hit I, and then scaling. And when that first beat hits at around frame 1, or sorry, around like frame 14, say, we will scale it all the way up. So we'll scale it up by hitting S and then hit I again, scaling with this brush thing, which you can't see anymore, selected. And then you'll see that this sort of thing pops up. If we want to sort of adhere a bit more to the beat, we can drag these keyframes around, so we can move it a bit forward if we like. But I would be cautious about making this too fast. I think something like that would be good. And you can just play with the syncing a bit, but that's not too important right now. I don't really care about teaching you how to sync this to music. I'm sure you can do that yourself. That's just a matter of dragging around keyframes. Alright, so that will be the first step in our animation. Then what we're going to do is create a couple of duplicate animations, which is a pretty useful skill to have. Alright, so let's create a square, just a plane. We're going to move it a little bit above the grid so they don't intersect. We do not want that in graphics. And we'll go into camera view so we can see the square here. And let's give it an emissive material. The color palette I'm going to pick is going to be like a bluish sort of white. So we're going to call this like cyan. And so you'll see this is blue. And what we want to do is let's practice that squash and stretch. So when's that next beat? So that's around here, 65 to 75. So we'll have it appear at 65, and then we'll make it sort of rush past the screen like that, up to 75. But we're going to use the squash and stretch principles. All right, so to make it appear, the easiest way of doing this is just by scaling it. So at frame 65, you want to hit I and set the scale. Then we can go 5 frames back. You can use the left arrow on your keyboard, and then you'll be at frame 60, and then you can hit S, then 0 to scale it to 0, and then it'll be completely invisible. So you can keyframe the scaling like that. Then at frame 65, you also want to have the location and rotation just so you're safe here. So make sure you have all of those things keyframed, and we can actually turn on auto keyframing for those things. So we'll go to keying, auto key, active keying set, and then we'll just switch this to location, rotation, and scale. And yeah, that's perfect. So also for this playback, you want to have AV sync on. This won't make a difference if you're not doing video editing, I think. It'll just make sure the audio is synced with your current scene, but since this is not too performance intensive, there shouldn't be any desyncing at all. Anyways, so we can have it appear like this. We can exploit the interpolations to make it sort of have a nicer, snappier reveal like this. And you can see how it sort of expands past the expected size and then shrinks down to the correct size. Which just saves us a bit of time. And then we'll just make it fly across the screen in the next 10 frames. So we're going to go to frame 75, we'll move this all the way over here, hit I, and then you'll see that automatically the location, rotation, and scale all get keyframed. So this is what it looks like. And you'll see that back interpolation is still applied, so it'll go a little bit past the screen, which is completely fine. So yeah, now we have a pretty cool animation, but this, in order to inject some more life, let's use the squash and stretch. So while it's moving this way, we'll flatten it like a bullet. So we'll hit S and then Y in order to just scale it on the Y axis, which you can see is this green one. Then we can hit I again. So all we've changed is the scale, so it'll shrink. And then as it gets close to this target, we can flatten it again in the vertical direction and make it a bit taller. And then we can keyframe it again with I. Now you don't want it to be too snappy, so we can always adjust the sort of speed of this, and I think that's looking quite good. Although we could maybe move it to adjust a bit more with the sync. All right, I think that's good. And so we have one square here, but I kind of want to have all of these moving. I want to have 4 squares moving in a spiral pattern, and I want to add some delay. So let's start by adding a delay. So you want to duplicate this, move it, let's say, up above your original by hitting Z to lock it to the Z axis and G to move it. And then we'll change this color. So you can hit that too. We'll call this white in order to make its own material. And then we'll turn it white. Maybe a little bit blue. And so these two are going to be doing the same thing in the same place also, which is not what we want. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create an empty. And this is a way to sort of manipulate the position of things. Since the position is keyframed, we're not going to be able to move it down because its position has already been keyframed. So instead of doing that, we're going to sort of attach it to a parent empty, and then we're going to move it down. So let's select our white square, then select our empty, and hit Control P, set parent to object, and now you can see that we can move it down and there's no problems. So this basically just lets us manipulate already animated properties. That's sort of the whole idea of why we want to use an empty. And now in order to delay it, all we have to do is use this, hit B to do a rectangular selection, select all of these keyframes, and then move them up by like 4 or 5 keyframes. And then you'll see a delay. That's pretty cool. You'll also notice they're a bit offset. The reason for that is because we have a perspective camera. So let's change that to orthographic. Okay, now it's a bit way too zoomed in, so we can change the orthographic scale so it correctly fits the frame. As we saw in our previous video about composition, we can also turn on composition guides. So we can use this golden ratio thing in order to just give us a nice overlay of where we might want to have our components. And that's sort of our, that's what I will call motion blur for now. That's sort of the idea. You don't want to have this too far down because I don't think we want to have the background grid overlaid on top. So we can actually just move this down a lot. And we'll just move these a bit closer together. I also think these should be a bit closer together, so I'll reduce the offset time. And that's what our first effect will look like. Another small alteration, you may want to just reverse the colors. I think having white as a primary and then blue as our motion blur material will be a little bit nicer looking. Okay, so now how do we duplicate this? I guess we could do this again for each of the 4 corners, but that's kind of a pain. So instead, what we can do is create more empties. So let's have this at the frame where you can see both of them, 65, and let's parent the top to this empty as well. So we'll hit Control P, object, and this won't change anything, except now we can move both of them with the parent. And now what we want to do is select both of our objects and our empty, and then duplicate everything. So we have a second set of these, and then we can rotate it 90 degrees by hitting R and then 90. And then we'll move it into the corner that we want. And then we'll do the same thing again, R90, after duplicating with Shift D. And then once more, Shift D, select R90, and then we'll just move it into position. And now watch this. So these go too far, as you can see, but we have these empties to fix that. So if you remember, we stopped these on frame roughly around frame 75. So what we can do is we can actually keyframe the position of the empties in order to help us. And this will get a little bit chaotic. So remember this empty, you can see it's connected to these ones. So what we want to do is we'll start our keyframe of the empties position. So just hit I with your mouse over the 3D viewport at frame 65, and then at frame 75, you'll see our targets are way too far. So let's fix that. We can move our empty up on the y-axis, and this will sort of offset the overshooting by duplicating. And you want to just make sure the final position looks good. So say around frame 80, we can have it like there, hit I. And we want to do the same thing with this one, which is also out of frame. So we're just going to move this at frame 65. We'll keyframe the position just to have an initial position. Then at frame 80, sorry, this one. So, oh, sorry, that's the wrong thing. So we'll keyframe at frame 65. Why do I, yeah, okay, that should be the right one. And then we'll go to frame 80. And you see it's hooked to this one, which is off frame. So we're going to just move it into the corner at frame 80 and hit I. And frame 75, this will be a bit out, so I'm just going to move it a bit closer. And if we go into rendered view, we can see how this looks. Now we can move them out of frame fairly easily. So to sync with the music a bit, we're going to have these just keep moving in the direction that they are moving. So you can see that they sort of form a spiral circle around the center of the image. So let's select all of the empties. And that last one's right here. Hit I to keyframe all of their positions at frame 90. And then let's go to frame 95. And we'll just scale all of them, just so everything ends up out of frame. Then hit I again, and you'll see they just disappear. So we can clear the space for another animation. We can also, once we're done with it, we can just hide this by hitting H. We can hit Alt-H to bring them back, by the way, so you hit H to hide them, and then they won't clutter up your viewport anymore. So let's just take a quick look at how that appears. Alright, so that looks good. So now we're at frame 95. So the next beat drop is sort of here, about frame 130. So let's make a cool shape morph. So what we're going to do is let's create a plane, and this is going to be a triangle turning into a square. Okay, so in order to create this morph effect, we're going to be using Shapekeys. So in order to do that, we'll create a plane like this. Using Shift-A plane, we'll try to move it into the center of the screen. And we're going to apply our white texture, or white shader to it. We'll just scale it up so it's sort of centered by using our composition guides to tell. And then we're going to create some shape keys. So right now we have our basis shape like this. You can hit plus to create a basis, and you're going to be in the object data properties in object mode. All right, so now let's create, so let's see what these shape keys do. So if we edit something, sorry, okay, so first we need to add a new shape key. So we'll call this one triangle. And we'll call this one square. And so now with this selected, we're going to change this in edit mode. So let's just scale it down. The easiest way to make a triangle, I think, is just to select these top two vertices, scale it on the x-axis to 0, and you can just hit 0 on your number pad and then drag that down a bit, and you have an equilateral triangle just like that. Then we can move it so the origin is roughly centered by using the G key. And now you can see that it's going to just flip back to a square because we were on our triangle shape key selected. We had our triangle shape key selected. So in order to morph between them, we can change this value, and you see that's pretty cool. Another thing we might want to do is just rotate this a bit. So make sure in edit mode this triangle shape key is selected, and hit to go to edit mode with tab, and then let's just rotate it slightly, move into position. And now that's a much cooler effect. It looks sort of like it's folding. And what we want is an unfolding effect. So what we're going to do is scale this as we did previously. So the next beat's about at frame 130, so we're going to go here. And we're going to, at frame 130, this is going to be our maximum size. And remember how I said we could keyframe everything? We're going to keyframe the value of our shape key. And this basically interpolates between the vertex positions. So we'll start at a triangle, and then we're going to go down to a square. So at frame 130, we're going to be a triangle, so we'll hit I on this value thing. And we're also going to hit I on the 3D viewport in order to add our location, rotation, scale. Then we can go to frame 125, 5 frames back, hit S and 0 to keyframe it, and then we will have our position, or we'll have our scale to 0, so it'll just sort of appear like that. Again, we can add the bounce interpolation, or the back interpolation. Actually, you could add the bounce interpolation if you wanted, just so it pops up like that. And then as soon as it pops up, we're going to have it immediately start turning into a square. So how do we do that? Keyframe the value of the shape key. So previously it was 1, you can see like that. Then we go to 0. Again, just in order to do that, hover your mouse over the value you want to keyframe, and then hit I, and then it'll create a keyframe, as you can see from this diamond here, which will show up once you've keyframed it. You just want to make sure it's not a hollow diamond, it's a solid diamond. And yeah, so you can see that cool unfolding to a square. And then what we want to do is let's apply some of that squash and stretch again. So we'll move it over here by G and then X to lock it to the X-axis, scale it on the X-axis, maybe like that, hit I, and while it's slowing down, we'll scale it again on the X-axis. Sorry, my keyboard input seemed to be a little bit delayed. I'll just move it. Sorry, folks. Keyboard's not working. SX. Okay, great. Now let's keyframe that again. So we can see how we have that easy morph from being a flatter square into a taller square. And then we're going to have it sweep across the whole screen. So let's move it at frame 150 all the way here. We'll scale it down to a long bullet shape again, and we can even more exaggerate this bullet shape. And again, at the end, we'll just scale it up as it's getting closer to the end, like this. We've moved 5 frames forward again, and then we'll hit I, and we have another keyframe. And then we just want this to disappear because I do not think you want this on the screen, so we can go another 5 frames forward to frame 160, scale it on the X-axis to 0, and just move it off the screen so you can see that origin thing is out, and then hit I again on the 3D viewport, and that will place another keyframe. And so here's where we can create duplicates. So, and this is where duplicates really shine, I think. So let's create a couple more layers of duplicates this round. So what we're going to do is hit Shift D. Let's go to frame 131, just where we can see this. By the way, you don't need to follow these keyframes exactly. It's just what I think syncs best to the music, but it's totally up to you. So hit Shift D, and then you'll create another one of these. Make sure it's underneath, and we'll change the color to blue. Okay, and let's add another material for funsies. So we'll make an emission material. So just select it here or hit E, and we can change it to a darker blue. You may want to look up some color palettes while you're doing this. It may not be a great idea to just check. But yeah, so we can remove this to see what that color looks like. I think it looks pretty good. And we'll call this deep blue. And we're not going to use that right now. I just want to have another material. So we can duplicate this again, and we'll give this one the deep blue material. So now we have 3 layers. we're going to want to use that empty trick. So they're not all stacked on top of each other right now as they are. So we're going to need two empties. So this empty, just create an empty, it doesn't matter where it is. Select this, then select, oops. So select your triangle, then select your empty, hit Control P, parent, move it down. Do the same thing. So we have our blue one controllable. So we'll select the blue triangle. We'll select the empty we just made, which is positioned at the origin. Hit Control P, object, and then move it down a bit further. That's pretty cool. So we have this sort of 3-stack, but we can't see this because in orthographic view, things that are directly on top of each other will not be shown. It's not perspective view. So how do we make them seen? Well, we can use a offset like we did with the squares. So in order to do that, all we have to do is we'll just grab all of these keyframes and we're just going to shift them, say 3 frames or 4 frames to the right. And that's going to be this cyan triangle. Then you want to select this darker blue triangle and we'll move it like 8 frames to the right. And now let's see what it looks like. That's pretty cool, isn't it? There's definitely a lot of work, by the way, to be done on the colors. But yeah, this is not going to be too much about colors. There are tons of videos about color theory. You should look them up and pick maybe a nicer looking palette than this one. Go wild. So yeah, we have a cool reveal. And now let's make some text. So we can create a new text object by hitting Shift A, text, and we'll just scale this up. I'm going to turn this white. And the word we're going to use is motion. Although you can pick kinetic or whatever you want, really. I just like O's and I's because those are quite nice to animate. Now, if you want to use a custom font, all you need to do is go into these object data properties, open this font tab, and then select one. There's a font I like called Momcake. I'll leave a link to that. It's just a nice bold font, easy to see. That's quite nice. I'll leave a link to that if you want to use it. Otherwise, the Blender default's also fine. So now that we have this font and we have the word, we're not going to be able to edit it after we convert it to a mesh, so make sure you pick something, then go to Object, Convert to, and Mesh. And now this is going to be, when you go into edit mode, it's going to be an actual mesh we can play with. So previously when I did this in my text reveal video, I said to apply you want to apply a remesh modifier and scale it a bit. That can be helpful. If you're not seeing any problems, you don't really need to do that. Otherwise, if you're getting some problems with the Boolean, which I'll show you in a moment, then you want to scale it down or extrude it down. Then you can go to remesh and decrease this voxel size until it looks good. Don't go too far though, because it's going to take up a lot of vertices. So yeah, let's just make sure it looks good. And then we can hit A to select everything, hit P, and then separate by least parts. And now we'll have a bunch of different things. And my idea here is that we have these all come in from different angles. So let's select each of these letters. So you can hit Shift or hold down Shift while you're selecting them with the left key, the left mouse button. And then you can right click. Let's just set their origins to their center of masses. So they're all positioned rather than at this corner here, because it's going to be easier to work with. All right, and let's just move this off the screen. So let's say we want to have them coming in from opposite directions. So something like that. And we want to sort of center them in this golden ratio sort of composition guide. So in order to do this, as soon as these sort of reveal blocks get out of the way, we can start moving things into place. So we see we're at frame 155. I'm just going to make this a bit more evident. And we'll start with the M. So we'll hit I to keyframe its current position, move 5 frames, and then let's move it into the middle of this golden ratio composition guide, just to center it. Then we'll hit I again, and we'll set the interpolation to back. Okay, and let's keep on going. So at frame 160, we can move this O in, like that. Sorry, first we need to keyframe its initial position, then 5 frames later, frame 165, we'll move it into position and hit I again. And then apply a back interpolation. So we have a nice bouncy effect. All right, now for the T, so we stopped at 165, so we'll hit I, go 5 frames forward to frame 170, move it down, hit I, set the interpolation to back. Now, we can also have these overlap, so we don't have to start the next letter as soon as the final letter is done moving. We don't need to wait. We can actually have it so that this starts rather once the M is done moving at frame 165 or frame 160. We can have the O start moving at frame 159 or 158. And we can do the same thing with the T, so we'll just shift it back. So we have a sort of overlap in the motion. Now for the I, we can do a different sort of interesting reveal. So let's just go to a random keyframe where the T is almost done moving. We'll hit I to keyframe its position. Then let's just sort of scale it like crazy. Sorry. Okay, so let's move forward 5 frames. Go down here, scale it like crazy. We'll hit I again. And then 2 more frames forward, we'll scale it down to its original size. And we'll just move it into place. Hit I again, and now it'll be in position. We want to apply a back dynamic effect interpolation, and we have a nice sort of snap. Okay, so as you can see, there's a ton of different text like appearance effects. You don't need to just scale them in. You can move them from a lot of different angles, or you can like even shape morph them into place. So for example, for this O, let's do a different effect. So at frame, well, this I is almost done, frame 170, we'll hit I to keyframe the position, location, rotation, and scale. Go to frame 175, and we'll move it into place here, hit I, and then we'll go back to frame 170. And we're just going to scale this up so it's outside the screen and really big. Hit I, and you kind of overwrite that. Then we can apply again the back effect. You may want to let this, you want to have, just as a rule of thumb, you want to have more extreme animations take longer, otherwise they look sort of instant, which is kind of bad. We could even make this a bounce animation. As well as this one, we could make this a bounce also. And right before this O is done moving, we'll just move in the N from the side. So finally, we hit I to keyframe the position, move 5 frames forward, or 6 or whatever, it doesn't really matter. We'll just move it into place. Hit I again, and there we go. Now it's in position. Let's apply the interpolation effect, and we have a nice snappy intro. Now, if you want to add a little bit of that delay effect that we had before, it's the same process. We'll add an empty. Let's make this an empty cube. It doesn't really matter what the shape of this is. It's just nice to have a way to differentiate between them. We'll go into solid view for a bit of an easier time viewing them. And we'll select all the letters, duplicate them, move them down. Then, without unselecting these, shift select this, so it's the active object, Control P, and create the parent. So remember, this is our empty. And now let's move it down a bit. And you can see that all of these are moved down. Right, so if we want to offset all of the animation keyframes by a little bit, we can hit A with our mouse here, with our mouse over the timeline, hit A, and then we're going to just move it a couple frames forward. And then now we can use this effect in order to have a bit of an offset. Of course, we want to give all of these a different material. So again, without unselecting them, change the material to like white or the cyan material, and then hit Control L. Okay, so you'll see that only the active object, the one that's in green here for me, will have that applied material. In order to copy that material to everything, hit Control L to link the materials, and then materials, and yeah, you'll see this material thing is linked. We can do this one more time again if you want to have 3 colors or 4 colors or whatever you want. We just want to make sure these are not overlapping, otherwise you're going to have some very weird visual artifacts. And now, just sort of as an outro, we can just move the camera out of scene and flip it. So at frame 195 and frame 185, we'll create some keyframes. Frame 195, we're going to just sort of create a bit of anticipation by tilting it slightly in the counterclockwise direction, and moving it up a little bit, hitting I. And again, we can apply an interpolation effect. Then we're going to snap it very quickly. So 10 frames later, we'll rotate it completely upside down, and we're going to move out of the scene like that. And hit I again, and our camera will be gone. Now, if you want to add some camera motion blur, we can do this in Eevee by just hitting that motion blur, and it'll be automatically applied in real time, which is very cool. So yeah, that's sort of all of our effects. We have our squash and stretch effect. We have a bit of sort of motion blur by using offset animations. We have this shape morph as well as a squash and stretch effect on these squares. And we have a couple of ways to include some text with an outro, as well as some anticipation for the camera when it's moving. And of course, plentiful use of custom interpolations throughout. And finally, to send this to render, just go to the final frame of your animation, say 220. You can change the end time right here, or you can also change it in your render settings to 220, and you can see that the timeline changes with that. And you can just render it. So you can change the file format to FFmpeg. You can click this thing to change it to an MP4 container, and you want to turn on this audio. Otherwise, you want to have an audio encoding of MP3 or something like that. Just pick MP3. That's probably the easiest. Otherwise, your video will not have it won't have any audio. So you need to make sure this is set and be careful with this every time. And then just pick a location. Then we can go into the render tab. All right, never mind, that's been removed. Hit Control F12, and that will render your animation with the audio, and then you'll find it wherever you specify the output path. And that's it for our motion graphics intro animation using all of the principles we just talked about. And I think that's a pretty good practical example. I also think this video has gone on quite a bit too long, so what I'm going to do is I will talk about the static and looping animations a bit later. Maybe I'll make a bonus video for that, because I think this was probably enough. In the next video, what we're going to talk about is composition, so how we can add cool effects like color inversion, a glitch effect, color balancing, and a couple of other like chromatic aberration and stuff, a couple of other cool effects. So we're going to be using the video editor and the compositor to do that in the next video. And that will be a nice wrap up to our exploration of the elements of motion graphics. So if you're still here after, what, 41 minutes or like 50 minutes, thank you for watching all of this. I hope you learned something new. Please like and subscribe, and check out all the links in the description. Leave a comment if you want to see something else in the future, if you have any ideas of stuff you want to see me make. And check out some of my other motion graphics videos, which you can find in my tutorial playlist. Alright, so I'll see you next time.